And one of the things that frustrates me is that I think there's a lot of people that believe that all histories are equal. And all histories are not equal. Some histories are significantly better. Some histories are garbage because the garbage histories are based on absolutely no historical evidence and really faulty analysis. And good histories are based on, solid evidence. Even though the evidence might be limited, very solid evidence has been thought of critically. It's been analyzed. We've taken human biases in, and we produce good history that way. Okay. So anyway, that's that lesson. Let's move on. Okay, I'm gonna learn you something. So historians gather all this evidence, right? But in framing our arguments, we have to interpret it, and historians often use theory to help them analyze and explain historical change. And the theories that we adopt have changed through generations. And the study of how historians have changed their interpretation of the past is called historiography. Historiography is literally the history of history. And it simply follows how, again, succeeding generations of scholars have looked at the past. And there are all these historical schools that we study, and we get kind of an insight into the history of those scholars and why they interpreted history in the way they did, because they're products of their own changing societies. So in American historiography, for example, there's different schools. There was the progressive school, which was around 1900, which tended to view economics as incredibly important. There was, after them, after World War II, and the country seemed kind of united, there was something called the consensus school, which was a fairly conservative historical school of interpretation that kind of said that no matter what our differences, Americans basically believed in the same basic values, and we had much more in common than we had differences. And then after that, you've got the 60s, and you've got the rise of something called the New Left, which was, again, kind of going back to progressive roots of economic determinism, but also, looked at the history of emerging groups like African Americans or Latinos, women. So you kind of see, you've got a women's movement and a civil rights movement coming up in the 60s, and of course historians see that, and they kind of, okay, we're gonna look at history through that lens. And so you have these new schools. And there's something called the New Western history. I was trained as a Western historian, meaning an historian of the American West. I mean, which is a really interesting scholarly endeavor. It kind of touches my heart because I'm part Native American, as I said, and we look at the West as a region. Why is the West different from the East? And there's some argument over that. It all actually goes back to a historian named Frederick Jackson Turner. He was, even predated the progressive school in American historiography, and Turner was trying to interpret American history and kind of saying, well, are Americans different from Europeans? And he said, well, yeah, they are. And he's writing this in the 1890s, and he presents this at this conference in Chicago, and he says, well, yeah, we're different because we had a frontier experience. Unlike Europeans that had these set governments and, oppressive governments, going back to the days of feudalism, Americans didn't have feudalism. They didn't experience that. What they did was they showed up in North America and they began moving west. And as they moved west, they got farther and farther away from the trappings of government, from centers of power and authority. And because of this, they had to become rugged individualists. They had to become independent. They had to survive on their own. And because of this need for rugged individualism and independence in order to survive out in the frontier, Americans adopted democracy as their form of government. They're wedded to democracy. They have an individualistic spirit versus kind of a collective spirit. This is why, for example, if you're trying to figure out why communism would never work in the United States, is because, someone who believed in Turner's view of history would say, well, it's because of the frontier experience. And so historiography is the study of these different schools of interpretation. And all these schools, by the way, come and go, right? They have what are in their paradigms, right? A paradigm is a way of thinking. And all paradigms, appear and they disappear because they undergo something called paradigm stress, right? You've got a paradigm about this is the way the world works, and then suddenly something happens that shows that, hey, maybe my paradigm actually doesn't explain the past very well. And, for example, with Turner, his paradigm began to fall apart because of World War II and the Great Depression, and the West was actually, historians started to look at the West in different ways, and they started going, well, hey, the West isn't full of rugged individualists. The West is actually really a dependent region, meaning it's dependent on federal dollars. It's dependent on the federal government for its development. And if you look at, for example, water, the issue of water, the West couldn't have developed. I'm talking about the Trans-Mississippi West, the arid West. The West couldn't have developed without massive outlays of federal monies to build dams and to build aqueduct systems and things like that. And in fact, the West is, rather than, we always think of the cowboy experience and just these lone individuals out in this arid region that's largely empty. The West is actually the most urbanized region in the United States. Look at a satellite map of the United States that shows, at night, where you can see all the lights in the country. These are like really beautiful satellite imagery that shows the entire country. And you'll notice if you look to the east of the Mississippi River, all the lights are kind of spread out because you've got little towns, right? And you have cities and then little towns and then rural areas, but rural areas that still have a decent population, but everybody's kind of spread out. And then you cross the Mississippi and you get past, say Western Texas. And after you get past Western Texas, suddenly all the lights go out and there's nothing. It's like totally black all the way to the Pacific coast, except for these blobs of light that are massive. Las Vegas, Los Angeles, San Diego, Phoenix, Salt Lake City. So just black, big blob of light, more black. Because these urban areas are surrounded by deserts. And they're urbanized largely because of aridity, because there's no water out there. So you can't have family farms that are just kind of evenly spread throughout the landscape. It's an urbanized society. And Frederick Jackson Turner never talked about, for example, Latinos. He never talked about Asian immigrants. He never talked about Native Americans, really. All it was this westward movement. It was just Europeans moving west through the frontier and civilizing it, against savagery, the savagery of the wilderness. And so in the historiography of the American West, you've got this westward movement. In fact, when I started teaching at my university as a young scholar, it came on in the class they wanted me to teach was called The Westward Movement. And the first thing I asked my colleagues, my senior colleagues, who were all tenured professors, I was a new assistant professor, I said, we got to change the name of this course because this isn't how we teach it anymore. It was how I learned it at my undergraduate institution, The Westward Movement, Frederick Jackson Turner, the frontier thesis, Americans are individual because they had this frontier experience as they moved west. And what my school of historiography was, the New Western History, said, hey, the West wasn't, number one, you're ignoring everybody else. It's okay to talk about these people that moved west, but you're ignoring everybody else because, number one, there were already people there. Native Americans were there. It wasn't an empty frontier. Number two, there was a Spanish frontier. And therefore, if you're dealing with Spanish or Mexican history in regards to North America, you're dealing with a northward movement where Spaniards and Mexicans moved north into New Mexico, Arizona, California, etc. I was even telling you about, my Native American tribe that has a land grant that's in Spanish from the Spanish government. So my tribe was interacting with Spaniards and Mexicans as they were moving northward into our territory. Well, Turner never talked about that. And he never talked about Asians moving into California, particularly, during the gold rush and after, in creating these vibrant communities. And so they're experiencing an eastward movement. And then you have Russians. I mean, you go to California, and just a few miles north of San Francisco, there's Fort Ross. There's Fort Rus, right? It's a Russian fort, because the Russians were here and they were trapping otter and different types of animals carrying fur, primarily otter. And they're coming out of Alaska. They've colonized Alaska, and they moved down, and they've got a southward movement. And so the West is really this crossroads where all these different cultures come together and interact. Sometimes they fight. A lot of times they fight. Sometimes they get along, and sometimes they intermarry, and they blend cultures. And that's really something that Turner missed. And so the frontier thesis had paradigm stress, right, because of all these different interpretations. And then finally kind of falls apart. Very few people believe in the frontier thesis anymore, although, there could be things we can pull out of it and say, maybe Americans are different. Maybe Americans do have a bit more of a commitment to democratic principles, certainly a commitment to gun ownership because of that frontier experience. So yeah, there are certain things we can save from it, but, is it completely right? Well, no, it's not. And so theories in American historiography suffer this, this paradigm stress, and eventually they kind of collapse. Some pieces are left, but they're gone in regards to being a school of historiography. And so this is important to know if you're going to be working in history, that you always look at not only the evidence, but if you're reading secondary sources, things that other scholars have written, what school of historiography do these people typically follow? And that's something important to know if you're dealing with history. Okay, and we'll talk about it a little bit more when we talk about, kind of the what-if notions of history. All right, so now you know something about historiography. Let me tell you a little bit more, though, about historical schools that inform us. Okay, now you know the basics of historiography. So let's look at different schools. Marxism, for example. I wrote, Karl Marx, they're a bunch of bloody red communists. Well, regardless if you feel about Marxism politically, Marxism is, at its base, a school of historiography. Karl Marx was, a social scientist, and he's a bad guy in Americans' view of history, but Marxism is no more than a critique of human history. And if you strip it of its political implications and a lot of evil that was caused by, dictatorships that came out of that philosophy, essentially all Marxism says is that, human history is teleological. Teleological means we're constantly improving, or we're moving. And that what drives historical change in human history is economics. And I'm giving you kind of what I've called pig Marxism. Like, it's the most basic interpretation of Marxism. It's far more sophisticated than what I'm telling you guys. So please don't, I don't want some former professor of mine to come and say, what's he talking about? This is, he's robbing it of its richness. No, this is as basic as you can get. Marxism is a theory of history. It is based on economics. And you've got various historical epochs. And then, the first system of labor, the first economic system is based on slavery. And what happens is, the slaves are exploited. Eventually, the slaves get tired of being exploited, and they rise up and they overthrow the system, and slavery disappears as the primary system of economics, of labor. And then it's replaced by feudalism, right? You've got the kings and you've got the lords, and they've got everything, and it's agricultural, and who does all the work? It's the serfs, it's the peasants, right? Well, eventually the serfs, the peasants, they get pissed off. They don't like being exploited, doing all this work for the benefit of the lords, the manor lords and the kings and all that sort of thing. And what happens? You've got something called the French Revolution. Okay, so the peasants rise up, they kill the lords, they chop the king's head off, and you've got the destruction of the feudal system. And so that stage of history is over. What replaces feudalism? It's capitalism. Capitalism, yay. Okay, I love capitalism, actually. And as long as it's responsible capitalism. And what happens is, the capitalists take over these guys that own the means of production, the bourgeoisie come along, and they're running the show now. The problem is they've got workers, they've got people working for a wage, and they exploit them, And so the workers They simply, don't have enough to eat. They can't. They're not making a decent wage, a living wage, as we would call it. And then what happens is, right, they get ticked off, and then they form unions, and then they kind of move things a little bit forward in their way. But if it doesn't go their way, they're actually going to rise up and overthrow the government in a bloody revolution. Okay, and so you've got the Great Socialist Revolution. Then you move to the next epoch. The bourgeoisie is destroyed. The workers control the means of production. Yeah, and everything's going to be a little bit better. But still, there's still some people in power. So you're going to have kind of the next stage, and it's going to be kind of a communist revolt where it becomes even more democratic, and the government fades away, and we all live happily ever after in a utopian society where everybody's equal. Yeah, right. So anyway, that is my very bad interpretation of Marxism, but that's essentially what it says. Marxism is a theory of history. So, and obviously it has a lot of problems, because the problem with Marxism as a historical theory, I always felt, and you'll see this when I say about what if, about contingency, historical change is, I think, driven in part by contingency, historical accidents that kind of move us in one way or the other. The problem with Marxism, I always thought, was that it was inherently predictive. Right? It predicts the future. And because it predicts the future, we're going to move from this stage to that stage to this stage, and then we're in the capitalist stage, and eventually this is going to happen, and then we're all going to be living happily ever after in utopia where everybody's equal. Because it's inherently predictive, it's going to be wrong. And somebody who's critiquing Marxism or a Marxist historian will go, well, what the hell happened? Where's the great utopian society? We seem to be no better off than we were a couple hundred years ago. And yeah, I could have a really good argument, let's say debate with a Marxist historian that would get really sophisticated. But essentially, I think I'm kind of right. And a lot of people who don't subscribe to Marxism go, well, what happened? Why aren't we getting better? And look at the distribution of wealth. It seems to be getting into the hands of fewer and fewer people. And every communist revolution that's ever happened was incredibly oppressive and put more wealth in the hands of very few people. And it really didn't elevate the working classes or the peasants or whatever. So, what happened? And, they'll try to, well, the real revolution hasn't happened yet. They'll try to explain it away and just say, oh, we're just not there yet. It was the communist revolution in China was kind of a false revolution. It wasn't really a proletarian revolt by the working classes, etc. It was just a few people, sort of thing. So they call themselves communists, but they aren't true communists and things like that. So you never want to predict the future, because you're going to be wrong every single time. Okay, they've even tried to create computer programs that are going to predict the future. We're going to go this way, we're going to go that way. I'm sorry, I think human beings are too bloody unpredictable to develop a historical theory that's going to not only explain the past, but by explaining the past, explain what's going to happen in the future. Because we're dealing with human beings here. We're rational creatures. We don't always act in our own best interest. Nobody can really predict what we're going to do, and therefore any type of predictive model of history is bad, in my humble opinion. That actually goes on to so that's just one historical theory, but it kind of makes me think of something else. Here I'm on a rant. I don't know if this is what you're supposed to do in a podcast, but I'm on a rant. And about theory. One of my other doctoral advisors was economic historian, wonderful man, and taught me a lot. And through him, I learned about neoclassical economics and neoclassical interpretations of history. And in fact, this doctoral advisor of mine, he was trained by an economic historian who won the Nobel Prize. And that was one of these core memories for me, was he inviting me to dinner at his house because his mentor was in town. He was incredibly famous, and I'm sitting at dinner with somebody who had just won the Nobel Prize in economics, and I'm like completely petrified. And he goes, well, what are you working on, young man? Sort of thing. And I like barely, I'm trying to explain what I was doing in regards to my own research. And it was just a wonderful experience talking to this individual. And this is, why going to college can be fun, because you meet a lot of mentors that influence you. But anyway, neoclassical economics. And neoclassical economics basically takes the idea that human beings are rational economic actors, which of course, I immediately go, I don't believe that. But it's a good model. It actually explains a lot of human behavior in regards to our economic choices. And if you're a cliometrician, somebody who studies economic history and using statistics, it can be a very useful way of looking at things and looking at historical change. The problem with it, and I'm talking about different historical schools and different paradigms in historiography, the study of the history of history, the self-admitted problem of neoclassical economics is in explaining historical change is something called the free rider problem. Okay, not writer as in writing, rider, R-I-D-E-R, like you're riding a horse. The free rider problem. And what the free rider problem is that, okay, if we assume that human beings are largely rational economic creatures who make rational economic choices based on their economic self-interest, it's really hard to explain revolutions and other activities like war where your life is put on the line. Meaning that, let's go back to the French Revolution. The Parisians are storming the Bastille, and they're going to kind of launch the revolution. They're going to rebel against the king, eventually rebel against the monarchy, grab the king, grab the queen, chop their heads off, launch the French Revolution, etc. The problem with that in regards to neoclassical economics is, okay, you're a Parisian, you're just some dude walking the streets of Paris with your buddy, and you see a crowd, and they've got pitchforks, and they've got torches and everything, and they're headed to the Bastille, which is a French prison. And the monarchy is locking people up there, and so this is a symbol of the oppression of the French monarchy. And so you see everybody going down there, and you inquire what's happening. So we're going to get the Bastille, we're going to go tear it down, and we're going to release all the prisoners, and we're going to overthrow the king. According to neoclassical interpretation, they cannot, and more specifically, the free rider problem is the rational thing for you to do is what? Think about it. Walk away. Go home. And let the other guy do it. The rational thing for you to do is to let those clowns storm the Bastille and get shot. And you'll go home and be safe. And if they're all shot down, you're safe. But if they overwhelm the guards and take the Bastille and eventually move throughout the rest of Paris and eventually grab the king and eventually get to the queen, and I think they're all in Versailles outside of Paris, something like that. I don't really remember my French history. That was a long time ago. But the bottom line is, you're going to be safe. And if the revolution is successful, then you're going to benefit from it. But you never had to put your life on the line. You are a free rider. You're just going to ride the wave of that revolution. Okay? If you're a Russian in 1917, the most irrational thing to do is to join Lenin and the other different factions that went against the Tsar, against Tsar Nicholas II. You're not going to challenge his guards. You're not going to storm the imperial palace. You're going to go home and sit it out. You're going to be a free rider. And if those guys win, fantastic, and you're going to benefit from it. But if they lose, you didn't risk anything. So I want you to think about this in human behavior and what you might do is that, what would you be? Would you be a free rider, or would you storm the Bastille, right? And the problem with the model, again, let's get back here. We're talking about historiography and different approaches in regards to historical interpretation. If neoclassical economics is correct in regards to explaining human behavior, everybody's going to be a free rider, right? Because it's not in your economic interest to put your neck on the line. And so there never would be historical change because we're all free riders and we're all just going to sit it out at home. The reason I think, neoclassical economics explains a lot of our behavior because we are economic creatures, but, the free rider problem shows us that human beings aren't always rational. And so because we're not always rational, okay, certain things are going to happen that cannot be predicted. And because they can't be predicted, we have choice in history. History isn't going to move in this deterministic, direction where I can tell as a Marxist historian, this is the way it's all going to play out. Well, no, you can't, because human beings are not rational creatures, and that's the mistake Karl Marx made, and that's the mistake, people that are really truly wedded to neoclassical interpretations of history. That's the mistake they made.